In the dead winter of 1887, a single photograph crossed a desk at the Charleston courthouse and quietly unsettled everyone who studied it. The image showed 17 children standing barefoot in fresh snow outside a collapsing cabin deep in the West Virginia mountains. Their ages ranged from barely 3 years old to 16, their bodies thin, their faces empty. What froze investigators wasn't just the cold captured in the image. It was the iron shackles clearly fastened around the children's ankles, and the fact that official records for the Greylock family of Bone Creek Hollow listed only 4 children living in that home. 13 of the faces in the photograph did not officially exist. No birth records, no school rolls, no church registrations. According to every document that mattered, they were ghosts. Before we go deeper into what the Greylock family hid in the Appalachian wilderness, make sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment and tell me what states you're listening from. I love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten chapters of American history. That photograph was only the surface of a mystery that would later be recognized as one of the most systematic cases of child exploitation in American history. Bone Creek Hollow itself was part of the crime. By 1887, the valley was so isolated it might as well have existed outside the United States altogether. Surrounded by steep ridges and narrow passes that became impassable during winter, the hollow sat 27 miles from the nearest town. Cedar Ridge, reachable only by twisting deer paths that could swallow outsiders whole. For generations, the families living there followed an unspoken rule. What happened in the hollow never left it. The Greylock family had claimed Bone Creek Hollow in 1834 when Jeremiah Greylock led his family through the Cumberland Gap. Unlike other settlers chasing land or fortune, Jeremiah understood something darker. Isolation meant freedom from law, from churches, from questions. The hollow offered water, fertile soil, dense forests, and most importantly, distance. By the time his grandson Ezekiel Greylock took control, that isolation had been transformed into power. Ezekiel Greylock ruled the hollow like a private kingdom. Officially, he oversaw a simple mountain homestead. In reality, he controlled an entire hidden system of relatives, hired hands, and children known in county records only as wards. Children whose origins were never questioned and whose suffering was never tracked. Ezekiel was tall and spare, sharp-eyed and calculating beneath a carefully maintained image of mountain ignorance. His intelligence was underestimated by outsiders, which suited him perfectly. His wife, Martha, hardened by decades of isolation, enforced discipline with a cold efficiency that left no room for mercy. The 4 Greylock children, acknowledged by the state, reflected the household's cruelty. Samuel, 19, already carried his father's calculating cruelty. Rebecca, 17, practiced quiet, deliberate violence. The twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, learned early that obedience meant survival and silence was mandatory. But these 4 were only the visible portion of something much larger. The real strength of the Greylock operation came from children who could disappear without consequence. In the late 19th century, records were loose, communication poor, and death common. The Greylocks exploited every weakness. Desperate families from nearby hollows would bind out their children during harsh winters, believing they were securing food and safety. Once those children entered Bone Creek Hollow, they were erased. Families were told the children had moved on or died. No one followed up. Others arrived through darker means. Orphans from failed homesteads. Infants left at remote churches. Children whose parents died in mining accidents or epidemics. Corrupt officials, traveling preachers, and paid neighbors helped funnel them into the hollow in exchange for silence and small payments. By 1887, this system had been operating smoothly for over 20 years. On paper, the Greylock household numbered 6. In reality, 21 people lived in Bone Creek Hollow. 17 of them existed in total darkness, bound by labor, hunger, fear, and brutality. The photograph that reached Charleston did not expose a sudden crime. It revealed a machine that had been grinding children into silence for generations. The photograph that would ultimately expose the Greylock family was never meant to become evidence. It began as nothing more than a business opportunity. In December of 1887, a traveling photographer named Henry Petton was moving through the Appalachian Mountain communities, offering family portraits for 50 cents a sitting, for families who might never see another camera in their lifetime. It was a rare chance to leave behind proof that they had existed at all. Petton first heard the name Greylock while staying in the town of Cedar Ridge. Local merchants spoke of Ezekiel Greylock with a curious mix of respect and discomfort. They described a man who always paid in cash, never argued prices, and somehow produced far more crops, livestock, and preserved goods than any family living in such isolation should have been able to manage. These stories intrigued Petton. A prosperous mountain patriarch with a large family often meant a sizable photography commission. On December 15, 1887, he packed his equipment and made the difficult journey into Bone Creek Hollow. What he found there unsettled him immediately. The Greylock homestead was nothing like the crude cabin he had expected. Instead, it was a carefully planned compound. The main house was built from expertly hewn chestnut logs, fitted with glass windows, and anchored by a solid stone chimney. Around it stood barns, workshops, storage buildings, and several long structures that looked less like family dwellings and more like barracks. The place felt organized, controlled, intentional. Ezekiel Greylock greeted him warmly and proudly introduced his 4 official children. They were clean, well-dressed, and unnervingly disciplined, answering questions with rehearsed politeness. At first glance, they appeared to be the image of a strict but respectable mountain family. But as Petton began setting up his camera in the central courtyard, he noticed movement at the edges of his vision. Other children, thin shapes, slipping between buildings, watching him from doorways and shadows, disappearing the moment he turned his head. Their clothing was patched and worn. Their posture suggested fear more than curiosity. When Petton cautiously mentioned these other children, Ezekiel's explanation came smoothly. They were orphans, taken in out of Christian charity, distant kin. The children of hired hands. In the mountains, such arrangements were common, he said. Nothing out of the ordinary. The answer was reasonable enough to quiet suspicion, at least on the surface. Then everything unraveled. A sudden commotion erupted from one of the outbuildings. The sound of running feet, raised voices, and beneath it all, the unmistakable rattle of metal on stone. Moments later, several children burst into the courtyard, and Petton finally saw them clearly. They were emaciated, their eyes sunken and distant. Their clothes hung off their bodies like funeral shrouds, and around each of their ankles were iron shackles, connected by short lengths of chain that allowed them to walk but never run. Chaos followed instantly. Martha Greylock screamed orders with terrifying familiarity. Samuel and Rebecca moved quickly, grabbing the children and striking them with leather straps as if performing a daily chore. Ezekiel's mask of hospitality vanished, replaced by cold efficiency as he barked commands to restore order. It was no longer a family scene. It was a system revealing itself. And in that moment, Henry Petton acted on instinct. His camera was already prepared. Without thinking, he triggered the shutter. The image it captured froze 17 children in the snow, chains visible, faces stripped of hope. It was a truth too raw to deny. Ezekiel realized immediately what might have happened and demanded the photographic plate. Thinking quickly, Petton claimed the exposure had failed and that he would need to prepare a new plate, while pretending to reset his equipment. He secretly preserved the original image and staged a second photograph this time, showing only the 4 official Greylock children posed neatly before the house. Satisfied, Ezekiel allowed him to leave. That night, Petton carried 2 plates out of Bone Creek Hollow. One showed the family as they wished to be seen. The other showed what they truly were. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and turn on notifications. Stories like this survive only because they are retold. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and help keep these buried truths alive. 3 days later, back in Cedar Ridge, Petton developed the plates in his hotel room. His hands shook as the image of the shackled children emerged. They seemed to stare back at him, silent and accusing. He understood immediately what he was holding and how dangerous it was. For weeks, the photograph remained locked in his studio safe. Petton wrestled with fear, doubt, and the crushing realization that the law might not protect the truth. Child labor was common. Abuse was often dismissed as discipline. Powerful landowners were believed over outsiders, were still. Quiet inquiries revealed that the Greylocks' influence extended far beyond their hollow. When Henry Peden finally approached authorities in Charleston, the response was cautious, skeptical, and deeply troubling. The county sheriff, James Rutledge, listened to Henry Peden's account with careful skepticism. He didn't outright dismiss the claims, but he emphasized the practical difficulties of investigating a powerful family buried deep in inaccessible mountain terrain. What unsettled Petan more than the hesitation was the sheriff's clear familiarity with the Greylock name, and his reluctance to explain why. After repeated questioning, Rutledge finally admitted that Ezekiel Greylock had long been considered helpful to law enforcement. He was a man who provided information about mountain criminals, runaway laborers, and suspicious outsiders. To the authorities, Greylock was not a problem. He was a resource. That admission changed everything. Over the following months, Petan began quietly investigating beyond Bone Creek Hollow. Court records from multiple counties revealed that Ezekiel Greylock had formalized dozens of child placements over the past 15 years. On paper, everything appeared legal. Orphans and destitute children were listed as apprentices or adopted dependents, with judges approving the arrangements and clerks filing the paperwork. But when Petan attempted to trace those children, he discovered a chilling pattern. After being placed with the Greylocks, Bunny said, "No school records, no employment records, no marriage licenses, no death certificates. Even more disturbing were the financial connections. 2 county judges and a senior court clerk had received large personal loans from Ezekiel Greylock. During periods of financial trouble, debts that were never publicly repaid. Debts that ensured silence. The Greylock operation wasn't protected by force alone, it was shielded by mutual dependence, by favors quietly exchanged, and by officials who preferred efficiency over morality. The complicity extended beyond government. Local churches had received generous donations from the Greylock family. Ministers who might have raised alarms instead vouched for Ezekiel's character and even helped arrange placements, believing they were serving Christian charity. The family's reputation for discipline, productivity, and religious devotion made them the perfect solution for society's unwanted children. As Petan spoke cautiously with older residents from surrounding hollows, he began to grasp the depth of the collective denial. Many admitted knowing families who had sent children to the Greylocks during desperate times, but they all repeated the same story. The children had moved on, found work elsewhere, gone to towns far away. No one could say exactly where or how. Petan realized he wasn't facing individual criminals. He was confronting an entire social system designed to erase uncomfortable truths. Digging deeper into historical records, he found evidence that the current Greylocks had simply perfected a system begun generations earlier. Census documents from the 1840s and 1850s showed fluctuating numbers of children living with Jeremiah Greylock, the family patriarch. Children appeared and disappeared between counts. Early records described them vaguely as bound servants or apprentices. The pattern was unmistakable. More chilling still were fragmented reports from neighboring families, describing children who had supposedly run off after brief stays with the Grey. These disappearances almost always occurred during harsh winters, when travel through the mountains would have been nearly impossible. The children left behind all possessions, even personal items no runaway would willingly abandon. Bone Creek Hollow itself offered perfect cover. The land was riddled with caves, abandoned mine shafts, and deep ravines. Hunters sometimes reported finding bones or scraps of clothing in remote areas, but such discoveries were routinely dismissed as animal activity or accidents. No investigations followed. By the autumn of 1888, Petan had assembled evidence suggesting systematic child exploitation spanning more than 50 years. The photograph had not revealed a crime. It had exposed a legacy, a machine built on silence, convenience, and willful ignorance across generations. But proof alone meant nothing without someone willing to act. The break in the case came from a voice the Greylocks had failed to silence. Word of Petan's inquiries traveled through the informal networks connecting mountain communities, and eventually reached a woman living in Cincinnati under the name Sarah Miller. Her real name was Sarah Kellerman. She had been born in 1851, a neighbor of the Greylocks, and placed in Ezekiel's care at age 12 after her parents died of typhoid fever. She escaped 6 years later, When Piton met Sarah in December 1888, her testimony reshaped everything he thought he understood. The shackled children in the photograph, she explained, were only a fraction of the operation. Shackles were reserved for rebels. Most children were controlled through starvation, isolation, and psychological conditioning so effective that escape felt impossible, even without chains. Children were kept malnourished, strong enough to work, too weak to run. They were taught. They were unwanted, forgotten, disposable. Rewards were distributed just enough to keep them competing with one another instead of uniting. Bonds were deliberately broken. Siblings separated, friendships discouraged. The buildings Peton had assumed were dormitories were prisons in disguise. Windowless structures, heavy doors barred from the outside. Sleeping arrangements engineered to prevent solidarity. Food rationed not for sustenance, but submission. Before we continue, take a moment to support the forgotten liturgy. These stories survive only when people choose not to look away. Subscribe, stay with us, and help keep history's buried truths alive. Sarah's account made one thing horrifyingly clear. The Greylock family had not merely exploited children. They had engineered a system to break human beings from the inside out. The bound children were given carefully calculated rations, just enough to keep them working, but never enough to restore real strength. Sarah described a constant, grinding hunger that shaped every thought and decision. Food scarcity wasn't accidental. It was a tool. Children competed for scraps, turned against one another, and learned quickly that survival depended on obedience rather than cooperation. Unity was dangerous. Isolation was rewarded. What disturbed Piton most was Sarah's explanation of the family's long-term planning. The Greylocks did not see children as temporary labor. They envisioned permanence, generations raised entirely within the hollow, never knowing another world, never learning there was an alternative to submission. Children born inside Bone Creek Hollow grew up without birth records, schooling, or contact with outsiders. To them, the hollow was reality itself. These second-generation captives, as Sarah described them, were the most tightly controlled. They lacked the memories or reference points that might spark resistance. Many were deliberately kept ignorant or nobler to read, unable to count properly, unaware that laws or protections existed beyond the mountains. Even when opportunities arose, escape was inconceivable because the idea of freedom itself had been erased. Sarah believed her own escape had been possible only because she had arrived at the hollow old enough to remember life before it. She knew something was wrong. She knew the world was larger. Air flight in 1869 had required months of preparation, saving food, memorizing mountain paths, and choosing a moment when pursuit would be unlikely. Survival depended on patience, not courage alone. She also revealed what happened to children who failed to fit the Greylock system. Those who could not work, who resisted control, or who were deemed unnecessary, were removed in ways meant to send a message. Their disappearances were never explained. Their absence became a warning. The remaining children learned, without words, what resistance cost. These lessons created absolute compliance. Fear replaced hope. Silence replaced rebellion. Sarah's testimony also exposed the broader economic machinery behind the operation. The Greylocks' prosperity did not come solely from unpaid labor. They were involved in theft, fraud, and the quiet exchange of people as commodities. Certain children were transferred to other criminal enterprises far beyond West Virginia, disappearing into distant regions where their origins would never be traced. Ober de Cádiz. The family refined methods of acquiring land and resources. They targeted vulnerable neighbors, offering help during financial hardship, then slowly tightening control until property, livestock, and eventually children were absorbed into the Greylock domain. All of it was done gradually, legally on paper, and hidden beneath the appearance of respectable mountain life. Perhaps most alarming was Sarah's confirmation that Bone Creek Hollow was not unique. During her captivity, she encountered children who spoke of other places, other families, other hollows operating under the same principles, different names, same methods. The implication was staggering. The Greylocks were not an anomaly. They were part of a regional pattern that thrived in isolation and silence. By the winter of 1888, Peton understood the scale of what he was facing. This was not a single crime, or even a single family's secret. It was one of the most systematic cases of organized child exploitation in American history, and the very depth of the corruption made justice nearly impossible. Too many officials were compromised. Too many years had passed. Too many people depended on the lie remaining intact. Armed with Sarah Kellerman's testimony, Petain spent the early months of 1889 trying to build a case strong enough to survive political pressure, but his efforts soon revealed a terrifying truth. Sarah's escape had not gone unnoticed. In February 1889, she received a letter at her home in Cincinnati. It was brief, carefully written, and unmistakably threatening. It named her. It named her family. It warned her that the past had not forgotten her. The message was signed with a crude drawing of a Greylock flower. The realization was devastating. The family's reach extended far beyond the mountains. They had tracked Sarah across state lines. They knew her new life, and they were willing to use it against her. Petain immediately moved Sarah and her family to safety and began investigating how she had been found. The answer was chillingly simple. Marriage and birth records in Ohio showed that clerks had received inquiries from supposed relatives seeking reunion. Small payments had followed. Information had been shared. The system that protected the Greylocks was not confined to West Virginia. This discovery forced Petain to confront an even darker possibility. If the family could track former captives, they could also track investigators. His own questions, his own movements, may already have been reported back to Bone Creek Hollow. That fear became reality in March 1889, when Petain returned to his Charleston studio. Nothing had been stolen, but everything had been touched. Files examined, drawers shifted, his safe opened without damage, and on his desk lay a single Greylock flower, its white petals already wilting. A message without words. He was no longer just an observer. He was a target. The flower left on Petain's desk was not just a warning. It was a promise. A signal that the Greylocks were no longer hiding. And just when it seemed impossible for the horror of Bone Creek Hollow to deepen, the situation began to accelerate in ways no one had anticipated. If this story is sending a chill down your spine, take a moment to share it with someone who is drawn to dark, forgotten mysteries. Support the work by leaving a like, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story is far from over. As the threats against Petain intensified, unsettling reports began to emerge from the mountains themselves. Travelers passing near Bone Creek Hollow spoke of unusual nighttime movements, groups of men traveling through forest paths long after dark, and the persistent sound of construction echoing from the valley. Locals noticed armed figures guarding routes that had once been open trails. Merchants observed a change in the Greylock's bullion abbots, with purchases suggesting preparation rather than routine large quantities of preserved food. Medical supplies, ammunition, and materials suitable for reinforcing structures. The family was no longer behaving like isolated farmers. They were foot. At the same time, people who had quietly assisted Petain began experiencing their own forms of pressure. A former clerk who had admitted to cooperating with the Greylocks saw his property destroyed under suspicious circumstances. A shop owner who had discussed unusual transactions found his records disturbed while nothing else was taken. A local minister who had raised concerns about child placements received visits from strangers asking unsettlingly personal questions. The message was unmistakable. Silence was enforced, not requested. The scope of the Greylocks' influence became impossible to ignore. They were not just wealthy or feared locally. They had the reach to coordinate intimidation across wide areas, to monitor investigations, and to respond decisively when threatened. Even more disturbing was the reaction Petain received from federal authorities. Instead of support, he encountered resistance. Officials questioned his motives and warned that his inquiries risked disrupting established relationships in the region. It became clear that the Greylocks had positioned themselves as sources of information about other criminal activity, earning protection in exchange for cooperation. Their crimes were known. They were simply tolerated. By the spring of 1889, Petain realized he was no longer fighting a single family, but a system. The photograph that had begun his investigation had become evidence not only of suffering in one hollow, but of institutional failure on a national scale. And then came the news that shattered any remaining illusion of containment. More children had vanished from nearby mountain communities under circumstances that pointed unmistakably toward Greylock involvement. The family was not retreating. They were expanding. Petten understood that time was slipping away. His witnesses were terrified. His evidence, while compelling, was still vulnerable to dismissal, and children continued to disappear into a place designed to erase them. Then, unexpectedly, everything changed, not through law or force, but through a single act of defiance. On the night of May 15, 1889, a boy named Michael Brennan escaped from Bone Creek Hollow. He traveled 4 days through treacherous mountain terrain until he reached the town of Cedar Ridge. What made his escape extraordinary was not only the distance, but the fact that Michael had never known any world beyond the hollow. Born there, raised there, and kept isolated for 14 years, he had no memories of freedom, only an idea of it. Michael's arrival created immediate shock. Unlike previous escapees, who could be dismissed or discredited, he carried knowledge that could not be easily denied. He had drawn detailed maps of the hollow, recorded names and ages of those still held there, and carried personal items that could be linked to long-missing children across multiple counties. His testimony matched official records with unsettling precision. What convinced authorities was not just what Michael knew, but how he knew it. As someone raised within the system, he had been given limited responsibilities that allowed him to observe and remember. Quietly, over years, he documented everything he could, understanding that one day the information might be the only thing standing between life and disappearance. Through Michael, the truth became undeniable. The hollow was far larger in scope than anyone had proven before. Dozens remained trapped, spanning multiple generations, and most chilling of all was what he revealed about the Greylock's plans. Faced with increasing scrutiny, the family intended to abandon Bone Creek Hollow entirely, relocating west to regions with even less oversight. Before leaving, they planned to erase their past completely. Michael had escaped because he knew there would be no second chance. His arrival transformed Pettun's investigation from a desperate struggle into a race against time. What had begun with a single photograph was now balanced on the testimony of one boy and the lives of many others who might not survive the summer. If you want to see how this final confrontation unfolds, stay with me. Subscribe now, because the next part exposes what happens when silence finally breaks and why some truths are buried so deeply, entire systems are built to keep them hidden. The Greylock family had relocated before, but never under such pressure, and never with so many lives at stake. Michael Brennan had overheard Ezekiel Greylock calmly discussing how to eliminate everyone in the hollow while leaving behind no proof that a crime had ever occurred. That was the moment Michael understood escape was not courage, it was survival. Staying meant witnessing the end of every life he had ever known. With Michael's testimony and physical evidence finally impossible to ignore, Sheriff Ruddle assembled a task force in absolute secrecy. The Greylock's network of informants ran deep, so the operation relied on federal marshals brought in from outside the region, a handful of trusted local officers, and civilian volunteers with no ties to local power structures. Any leak would mean disaster. The raid on Bone Creek Hollow began at dawn on June 3rd, 1889. What authorities found exceeded even their worst expectations. The hollow was not a farm or settlement, it was a deliberately engineered system designed to control, exploit, and erase human lives. Investigators uncovered proof of not just the 47 captives Michael described, but evidence pointing to hundreds of victims over more than half a century. Records meticulously documented arrivals, labor assignments, punishments, transfers, and deaths with the cold efficiency of a business ledger. Hidden burial sites confirmed what the documents suggested. Generations of suffering had been buried beneath the valley itself. Tools of restraint and confinement were found throughout the compound, revealing that cruelty here was not impulsive, it was methodical. Even more disturbing was what the documents revealed beyond the hollow. Correspondence linked the Greylocks to similar operations across multiple states. Children had been exchanged, sold, and relocated through a coordinated network that relied on distance, isolation, and corrupted officials to survive. Bone Creek Hollow was not an exception. It was one node in something far larger. When the raiding party arrived, the Greylocks were waiting. Ezekiel Greylock greeted them with calm politeness, presenting forged documents and claiming his operation functioned under secret government approval. He named officials, cited non-existent programs, and spoke with the confidence of a man who had avoided consequences his entire life. For a moment, it almost worked. But Michael Brennan walked beside the investigators. He led them directly to evidence Ezekiel insisted did not exist. He exposed lies with details only someone raised inside the system could know. Most chilling of all, Micah revealed that the family had prepared to destroy the compound and the captives with fire and poison. If discovery became inevitable, the plan had already begun. Several victims had been deliberately weakened earlier that morning. Authorities intervened just in time. The discovery made one truth unmistakably clear. Even when faced with exposure, the Greylocks valued silence over human life. The trials that followed became some of the most consequential in West Virginia's history. Ezekiel Greylock and his immediate family were convicted on multiple charges, but the courtroom revelations did not stop with them. Judges, officials, and law enforcement figures were implicated, forcing years of investigations that dismantled entire local power structures. Justice, however, could not undo everything. Many rescued children had no legal identity, no families left to return to, and no understanding of life beyond captivity. Some required lifelong care. Others vanished back into the mountains, drawn to the only world they had ever known. Michael Brennan survived and built a new life, becoming an advocate for child protection. But the weight of those left behind never truly released him. Henry Patton has photographed the image that started it, entered the historical record as undeniable proof of what happens when cruelty is allowed to hide behind respectability. The hollow itself was abandoned. Nature reclaimed the land. Communities chose silence over remembrance, but history did not forget. The Bone Creek Hollow case forced America to confront a terrifying truth. The greatest horrors do not always announce themselves. They thrive in isolation, protected by convenience, corruption, and the human desire not to look too closely. Those 17 faces frozen in that photograph still stare back at us, demanding remembrance, and perhaps that is their final justice. If this story unsettled you, that discomfort has meaning. It reminds us that vigilance matters, that silence has consequences, and that truth often survives only because someone refuses to look away. Before you leave, pause for a moment. Subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy not just for stories, but to remember the ones history tried to erase. Share this video with someone who believes darkness should be confronted, not ignored. And write in the comments, what part of this story stayed with you the most? Until next time, keep your eyes open because the forgotten are never truly gone.